And on today's show, how an engagement letter may protect you in litigation. Part 1 of this week's series on protecting your practice with best practices of prosecuting insurance attorney Elia Lirma. Hi everyone, I'm Steve Savant, syndicated financial columnist and contributing author to Backroom Technician and Innsmark. Let's get down to business. Well, welcome to the show, Elia.
Hi Steve, nice to see you again.
I just want to welcome you, and for all our baby boomers out there, they love your name because they remember Elia Kuryakin from Man from Uncle. And they probably haven't heard that name in 35, 40 years. So welcome to the show. Now, a lot of people are going to say, Steve, why do you have prosecuting attorney Elia Lirma on your show? Isn't she the enemy, right? I mean, because you really, one of your fortes, one of your main forte of practice is prosecuting insurance agents.
That's correct.
Okay, so people are going to say, Steve, why do you have the Darth Vader of our industry online? But what Elia is going to do for us today is she's going to introduce us to some best practices to keep ourselves out of hot water.
Sure.
And one of these is an engagement letter. Now, I have to say that every time I ask one of our advisors, do you use an engagement letter? Almost like maybe 10%, maybe 15% use it. But most of us don't. Why is an engagement letter so important, and why could it keep you out of some litigation hell?
You know, that percentage is far too low. Every insurance professional, financial professional should make it a habit to utilize an engagement letter. And the reason is it's a lot like a parachute. When you need a parachute, you're really going to wish that you had one. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, far too many professionals just rely on that interpersonal relationship. But the fact of the matter is a good engagement letter is your first line of defense against any kind of litigation. Mm-hmm.
When I'm constructing my engagement letter, what are some of the talking points that should be in there? It should be comprised. I want to talk about things that I'm going to do. I also want to know what my obligation of my client, what I should expect from them. Can you give me kind of a little potpourri of what I should be looking at?
Well, first of all, you want to define the scope of who it is you're representing. Are you just representing the head of a household in that particular instance? Or are you representing the interests of his family? You may be faced with that question in the event that there's a death in the family, and then all of a sudden you have family members inquiring about whether or not their financial interests were appropriately represented in the presentation of your financial plan or your insurance program for them.
I'm trying to think of an advisor. I'm coming, let's just stay in the insurance realm. I'm trying to format an indemnification strategy, and I'm going to include my home. I'm going to include my car. I'm going to do a pup policy. I'm even bright enough to put an umbrella policy on me. But I've noticed that sometimes in the way you have expressed things, even an umbrella policy may not be the defense we think it is.
Oh, that's correct. And your insured needs to be, and your client needs to be sure that they understand that. Unfortunately, insurance is a very complicated matter to the average consumer, and so they rely upon your professional advice. And so if you're not appropriately safeguarding and documenting your file with what you will be doing to protect them and what the policy itself will be doing to protect them, there may be some confusion. And there very typically is after a loss when it's far too late to rectify the problem. And at that point, the professional is faced with a potential malpractice claim.
Okay, let's say I did the right thing. Let's say I actually had an engagement letter, and now you're looking at it as the prosecuting attorney, right?
Right.
What are you looking for in that letter to say, yes, he did explain it, no, he didn't explain the rules of engagement, he didn't explain what he was going to do, he didn't set himself out correctly? What are some of the talking points when I'm looking at this from an attorney point of view?
Well, again, you don't want your engagement letter to be very narrow. You want it to be as specific as possible. Generic terms, those types of things aren't really going to help you because the engagement letter is supposed to define the course and scope of your representation. It's also supposed to define, again, who the client is and the length of time that you will be acting as advisor to them in a certain capacity. Is this something that they signed 5 years ago and you're still their advisor even though you haven't heard from them, but they continue to pay premiums and have their policies instituted through your office? Or is this something of an ongoing nature where they're in your office every month paying premiums? All of those factors really come into account when me as the attorney comes in and I'm evaluating what kind of relationship did you have. So the engagement letter should be very specific in terms of time. And if it's not specific, then the attorney has to look to things like that ongoing relationship and how the agent may have been compensated.
Well, can I make it, just make sure I want to make sure I understood you. So I may want to be not a very definitive what I'm going to do, spell it out, and I thought I just heard a second one, which I didn't think about. I have a time commitment. Now, should I put a time certain event here?
Well, are you being hired this one time to provide these financial recommendations or insurance recommendations on a one-time basis, flat fee? Or is this going to be a continuing obligation where the client's going to expect you to perform certain financial annual reviews or semi-annual reviews? And so if there's a difference in opinion, you want to make sure that you have a meeting of the minds with the client. And that's best if it's specified in the engagement letter.
So if I said in my engagement letter, I'm going to do an annual review and I didn't come back and do it, there's an issue.
That's a problem.
Wow. When we come back from the break, we're going to talk about a couple other issues. One is should I have my client sign a waiver on recommendations that I made that they didn't take? We'll be right back after the break. Back in the day, life insurance professionals were called field underwriters. Then, carriers trained their field force in the basics of life insurance underwriting. Today, the insurance industry doesn't educate the agent population as they once did. But now you can have the Informed Risk Guide at your fingertips so you can illustrate a reasonable rate class for your life insurance prospects. Just request your copy of the Informed Risk Guide at downtobusiness.ashbrokerage.com. It's free from Ash Brokerage, the practice enhancement company. Well, welcome back to our second segment. Ilya, I have to say, I make a lot of recommendations when I was in advisory, and I look at, like, retirement income would be a perfect example of this. I'm talking about long-term care. I'm talking about your retirement income. I'm talking about indemnifying you on your house, all the things that you have to do as a defense. I'm going to try to think about talking to an attorney for a will, maybe some trust work. I'm the quarterback, so to speak, of my client's financial concern. My client says, I appreciate your recommendation, Steve. I'm not doing long-term care. Okay, I say, fair enough, and I just go on with my life. Then all of a sudden, they go into a facility at 72, and their children come back to me and say, why didn't you offer long-term care? Well, I did offer long-term care, but they decided not to do it. Well, that's my word against their word, and I didn't get a waiver. Talk to me about getting a client waiver. I made a recommendation as a professional, as an advisor, and they didn't take my advice. I need to cover myself. Right. Talk to me about that.
Well, you have to understand that in the course of litigation, unfortunately, it's not really about truth, although it should be. It really comes down to evidence. What's the evidence? And what's the evidence that you had that conversation with your client? In today's day and age, where it's very easy to take notes and dictate letters through very accessible software on your computer, on your iPad, there's really no excuse for not sending a very simple, pointed letter to your client that says, I've made these recommendations to you. These are my strongest recommendations to you. For your personal reasons, you've decided not to pursue my advice. And that's it. You get bonus points if you actually have the client sign off on that acknowledgement. But something that basic can really save you a lot in terms of the course of litigation. If I were to see that as an attorney, that the insurance agent had that type of documentation in a letter, or even documentations noted in the file or on the computer file, that's going to send a signal to me that there's probably a much more difficult case here. I might look elsewhere.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand. If I've told the client and the client says, well, I don't feel comfortable signing your waiver. Let's just say they don't. So I still send a letter to him. I might even send it certified just to cover myself. I sent this at this date. I had a witness in my office witness my signature and that it was I sent that. That could be points. If I heard you correctly, I even have higher valued evidence going your route if I can get the client to sign off on it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I want to get into the. I want to be able to use the waiver. It's not a tactic to sell more. It's a tactic to protect the recommendations I gave as a professional. Because I could see some people saying, hey, the only reason you're doing this, you're just giving this huge litany of recommendations because a lot of product purchases are going to be here. Now, when I'm thinking about this, I'm looking at, I've looked at a client waiver, especially when I have other advisors involved. I may not have the full control of the client. Maybe the client's outsourcing his finance side, the securities, his actual portfolio. I only have the indemnification and the insurance. I was there only in that regard. This goes back to our first segment when we're talking about engagement letter. I have to define who I am and what I'm looking at because I have another advisor involved. I'm not the only person.
Correct. And the collaboration with that other advisor becomes important from the professional advice standpoint. But you also want to make sure that you're not burying your client in constant reaffirmation letters after reaffirmation letters. You want to save those types of confirmation letters for advice that you really think might be detrimental. And I'll tell you the context where I see this a lot, and this actually started the first part of my practice in suing insurance producers, was in a very straightforward context of auto insurance claims, where by Arizona law, where we are here, it's required that liability insurance that offers of uninsured and underinsured motorist limits be offered in the same limits as liability. And a lot of insurance producers weren't doing that, to the detriment of their client. They were effectively having them insured if they cause an accident, but if someone uninsured caused an accident to them, they weren't protected. And so that coverage is so important that Arizona law has multiple statutes dictating how uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage should be offered. And so that's really important coverage, and the state here has recognized how important it is. So in the context of UM/UIM coverage, what I tell agents and producers is make sure you confirm that. They have forms that they can use that protect the insurance company, but what protects you? Only your documentation of the conversations that you had with your clients and the confirmation letters that you send to your clients. And I would follow that up by saying that every time you have this conversation on an important topic, especially like UM/UIM, you want to make sure that you reaffirm that recommendation. This is important coverage to you. I'm recommending strongly that you take it. You've decided not to take it for your own reasons. And every time you have that conversation in their annual review, reiterate the importance of that and the fact that they've declined it. Because that history of you stressing its importance and the history of them declining it means I don't have a case.
Well, I think if I was just thought that if the state went ahead and imposed a law on this, that I would have to actually buy it. It's a mandatory piece, but are you suggesting no?
Well, absolutely not. The state mandates that it actually be offered, but there's no mandate that it be purchased. But I think that distinction is not often made. And a lot of times, insurance producers have the tendency to just simply slide a form across and say, sign here, sign here. And the insured doesn't actually know what they're signing or what it is that they're getting. So it becomes incumbent upon the insurance producer, because they have their own independent duty. Signing the form may protect the insurance company, but it doesn't protect the agent. It has always been my position that the agent has an independent duty. You have a license, you're educated, you have training, you're subject to regulatory agencies and their control. And so for that reason, you're not just a mere order taker, you're making recommendations to your insured. And if you don't make them appropriately in a way that they understand, then you should be held liable.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's show. Remember, before moving forward with any of the ideas, always consult your tax advisor and legal counsel and your broker-dealer compliance officer. Missed an episode? Just hop out to our website, downtobusiness.ashbrokerage.com. And remember, you could be wiser as an Ash Brokerage advisor. I'm Steve Savant. We'll see you tomorrow.